Okay. Hi, everybody. Today we have Rebecca Dovi joining us to talk about how modeling and simulation can fit into an AP CSP course. Rebecca Dovi is a master teacher with more than 15 years of classroom experience and a decade of experience doing professional development and curriculum development at the state and national levels. Rebecca is on the Education Advisory Council for Code.org. She is the first K-12 teacher to deliver a MOOC, a massive open online class for Amplify Education, Inc., a Google Fellow Trailblazer, and she has worked with the team developing and implementing the new AP CSP Principles course for the College Board as a pilot instructor. She's also a recipient of the Aspirations in Computing Award from the National Council of Women in Information Technology. Rebecca, thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you. I appreciate the offer. It's exciting to get to talk about CS principles. There's a lot of good stuff happening. So
awesome. That's great to hear. Well, we should just start off by asking you the most fundamental question. How do you see modeling and simulation fitting into the CSP course?
I'm actually really excited that you all are working on this. I think there are a couple areas of CSP. There's some areas of CS principles we have a really good idea of what that looks like. If we talk about teaching kids to code, at the high school level we have a pretty good idea of how that can work. But I think the two areas that are sort of hard for folks to grapple with a little bit are data in particular and then modeling and simulation. So I'm very happy you all are working with it, because right now there aren't a huge amount of resources. I think one of the things that's really exciting about CS principles as opposed to APCSA, and I love APCSA, but one of the things that really can be exciting about CS principles is you have a lot of opportunity to make very real connections with other fields. You're not just sort of coding in this silo. You can take your CS principles course and really take it any direction you want. If you want to do an arts-themed course, you can do an arts-themed course. If you want to do a science-themed course, you can really do that. And I think modeling and simulation are one of those areas that's really rich in terms of being able to pull in other disciplines to really help hook kids and get them excited about computer science. So in prep, I'm looking over here real quick. If we get a chance to talk about resources later, there's this really handy website that lets you search by keyword the essential knowledge statements. So if you've looked at them, it seems like 5 bazillion. It's almost 400 LOs and EKs that you have to know. And so there are quite a few here that work around modeling and simulation. And so it talks about using modeling and simulation to represent phenomena, and then also this whole idea of using them to formulate, refine, and test hypothesis. And I think in general that's not something we've done a lot of at the high school level in computer science. So I think that's one of those areas, and we're seeing a lot of research that kind of shows that bringing in underrepresented groups into computer science means we have to do a really good job of making very clear connections between, we're not just coding to find prime numbers, we're actually coding to solve real problems and really make a connection with how real professionals use code. And I think modeling and simulation in particular is one of those areas that really is pretty rich for some opportunities there.
Fantastic. So one of the things that the teachers are worried about are the performance tasks. And how do you envision modeling simulation being used in the create performance task?
Well, and just to back up so everybody knows, there are two performance tasks. I feel like I have to repeat this over and over again, but they kept changing the names while we were piloting, and so if I don't go over it, I forget. But the Explore performance tasks ask students to look at basically a computational innovation, and then the Create is one where they're coding, and there's a piece to that one that's collaborative also. It's real. Actually, my students right now are working on their Explore performance task as of this morning, so they are less excited about it, I think, than I am, because it's break almost. But in any case, I think the Create one in particular with the coding, again, anytime you can give that a context and a real connection, I think you're going to deepen the students' experiences. One of the things we found with piloting these is really trying to help students think about the kind of thing that they were going to code made a real difference in the quality of results that you got back. So if it was very open-ended and I'm trying to think of how to put it, but if it was sort of a problem that doesn't really have a purpose, if that makes sense, it didn't give them as much opportunities to really write about what they were coding. And I think that's the thing to remember with both performance tasks. It's really about their responses to the questions. Conceivably, you could have a student that maybe doesn't write the world's best program, but does a really good job in writing about how they coded together and the quality of their collaboration, and really answers those questions well, and they can still actually score very, very well on that performance task. So I think modeling and simulation in particular is a really good way of narrowing in and giving them a specific concrete thing that they can work towards, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so you mentioned the other performance task, explore performance tasks. How do you see modeling and simulation serving as the basis for the explore performance task?
I think sort of the same idea. Part of what my students today were doing, because it was a little 45-minute block, and as anybody who has ever taught knows, the week before Thanksgiving is not a huge amount of stuff you get done. They were kind of bouncing off the walls. So we spent the block brainstorming. We reviewed, for example, at the very beginning of the year, we actually co-construct a definition of a computing device. And it's something we cycle back to. And so the last couple of days, we've cycled back to what is computing, what are computer devices, and then they spent today brainstorming about computational innovations. And it's very interesting. So the very first thing you get is, this is not an iPhone, it's an Android, but you can pretend like one of the kids was like, oh, I want to do iPhone. It's like, okay. But the problem with that is it's a very, very broad topic, and it's fun and it's shiny and it does a lot of fun things. But in terms of being an innovation that actually really has created societal changes, I mean, obviously things have changed because of an iPhone, but in terms of a student doing research, that's a little bit too broad. So I think if they've done some concrete examples with modeling and simulation, and it's something we have to cover in the curriculum anyway, that's actually a huge area to really hone in and give them something specific that they can then go research in terms of being a computational innovation.
Great. One of the things the teachers are very worried about, especially in New Mexico, is the written portion of the performance tasks. How do you prepare your students for those portions of the performance tasks?
I think everybody's concerned about that part. I think it's one of the sneaky little things that's tricky about this class. For them to do well in the performance tasks, they need to be able to communicate very clearly, and especially in a written format. And so one of the things you really need to make sure they're doing is writing frequently. I honestly, my second year of my pilot, I was an official piloter for 3 years. Now I'm still teaching it, but not official piloting. But my second year in particular, the class got to be so popular, I went from 16 kids in the class to 90 the following year, which was fabulous until it came time to handling the writing piece. So I think there are a lot of things you can do. I use journals quite a bit. We do a lot of discussion board entries. If you like, I can get specific about how we use those. And one of the things I figured out, I was very, very lucky to be in a school that had an amazing English department. They were just a phenomenal group of English teachers. And so about a month into the second year, where I had 90 kids, I went in and had lunch with them one day and plopped down. It's like, please help. How do you do this? This is awful. I didn't set up to be an English teacher. And they really sat down and gave some very, very concrete things that you can do. So they walked me through how do you do peer review in formal writing. And it was stuff I wouldn't have thought of. So one of the tips that I got from that was, this is a technical form of writing, so you don't want students using emotion in their writing. So have them, basically when we do peer review, you want to be very, very specific in what you're asking them to do. Don't just read or have them read each other's paper and say, is it a good paper? Because 17-year-olds aren't going to do that very well. But getting very specific and say, read through and highlight every time you see them using emotional language. Or you might pick a specific, so I'm going to flip through. I have the create performance task open, and of course it's taking forever to flip. My PDF is not cooperating. I'm looking for I'm just trying to come up with an example question. All right, it's not cooperating right now. My PDF is frozen. But in any case, so picking one of the very specific questions about the performance task and have them, and you may not do this on the performance task itself, maybe earlier in the year ask them similar types of questions, but highlight every time they see their partner answering that particular question. Those types of things really, really help the students they will write more for each other than they write for us. They don't consider us as much of an audience, so they do a lot better writing when they're writing for each other. So that's why discussion boards are really helpful. And I think getting very specific, that also takes the burden off of you because you don't have to read every precious little sentence they do. One of the things I did a lot of in discussion boards is we worked a lot very early in the year on what makes a good discussion board post. So things like LOL, I agree, and stuff like that don't really move the conversation along. And so we did the very first couple discussion board entries we do in the very beginning of the year, very, very specific about this is a question that moves the conversation along. This is an answer that moves the conversation along. You get bonus points if you cite a reference to why you're saying that. I also, in my high school life, coached debate for a very long time. We ran a big national level debate team. So we do a lot of online debates where you divide the kids into two groups. And, you know, at first it was stuff like, you know, throwing out a topic like all U.S. citizens under the age of 18 should be banned from all social media. Oddly, kids have an opinion about that. You divide them into a pro, and usually you divide them before you give them the topic. Divide them into a pro and a con, and then they have to debate it out on the discussion board and give actual evidence of why they agree or disagree. And for a lot of those, I would actually give points. So we would keep a running total. The trick I learned with giving points is it's not as much about being fair in your point allocation. It's about keeping them within 3 points of each other. As soon as one team, this is awful, and if any student ever sees this, I apologize that I lied to you for all those years. But if you allow one team to suddenly get, I mean, you see this when you review in class. If all of a sudden one team has 30 points and the other one's at 0, the other team stops playing. So your goal is like, you know, well, I agree with that point, but it might be a little recycled. No, you don't get it. As you kind of develop that skill throughout the year, you can be less and less present in the discussion board. And it's not that you don't want to be in there scanning for appropriateness and that stuff, but you don't have to respond as much because they get used to doing it themselves. And again, they'll write for each other in ways that they won't write for us. So anything like that, and you know, bake some cookies and take them to your English department, and they will help you out because those people, they know how to handle writing. I think the last thing I would say, and especially I was in a fairly diverse school, and so some of my students were in the IB program and very, very strong writers, and then I had fair number of ESL students and students where this may be the only, quote, advanced class they would take, so their writing skills weren't as strong. Early in the year especially, I would not grade them for grammar and spelling. I have an advantage because I can't spell, so I never could find those anyway. But early in the year, it's about getting them to put words on paper. So, you know, journaling every day, do some kind of little fast start question, you know, a lot of the kind of strategies we learn out of exploring computer science about how to sort of scaffold that really help too. But don't get really, really mean about the grammar the first couple months of the year because they will, especially kids who aren't confident that way, will really shut down and they'll choose to get the 0 rather than put themselves out there if they feel like they're just getting criticized.
Fantastic. I'm Lisa Cundiff. I'm a CS teacher in Las Cruces, New Mexico. So the next question I wanted to ask you is, what's the most difficult part of the performance task for students in the pilot course?
You know, honestly, they've gone through so many refinements. Honestly, the very first time around, it was just they were very, very vague. So we've gotten very, very lucky. The performance tasks as we're seeing them right now have gone through an enormous amount of refinement. I think one of the biggest advantages we see right now is the word count. I know that's something when I do training, sometimes people grumble about that a little bit, but literally I had a kid during one of my first pilots. It was just a prompt that was one prompt, and then you're supposed to do a whole PT. And I knew it was supposed to be like several pages, but the kid wrote a one-sentence answer. You know, he was that Asperger's kid that we've all had, and he wrote a one-sentence answer. But when you read the question and read his answer, he'd answered the question. And so I think now, though, it's almost in a way, it's getting them over the fear of a performance task. It's a very unusual type of assessment for them, and there's a lot of anxiety around it when you first start. So a couple things I think that really help with that is do not wait until the performance task to read the kinds of questions. So you can take the questions that are in the performance task and pull them out. So, for example, my students are just finishing up their unit on the internet. They will have a quiz. hopefully none of them are watching, but they will have a quiz that pull out a couple of the questions from the Explore performance task, and we will treat the internet as sort of our computational innovation. And so they'll be asked the same questions, but in a different context. I think one of the things that's important to remember is we're not really supposed to help them while they're working on the performance task. It's supposed to be a summative assessment. And so anything you can do to pull it out of when they work on the performance task. Some of the other things I really spend a lot of time on is scaffolding when we first start them. A week or two before we start them, we read them. Everybody, I like highlighters if you can't tell, but we just go through and underline or highlight words they don't know. Like, that's it. Don't read to figure out what you're going to do or anything else. Just go through and highlight the words you don't know, and then work with your elbow partner and look those words up, and then we'll discuss as a group. And I usually use like a web search, sort of crowdsource it, so no one's sticking out because they don't know any words, but really making sure they understand all of the terminology in the questions, those types of things. And again, especially for your kids that are not like, valedictorian top 10, they love writing. For most of the kids I worked with, they really needed a lot of support with that.
Great. It's really weird. How do you assess the PT and the performance task to provide feedback to the students?
Technically, you are not supposed to. Once they start on that performance task, they are not supposed to be getting feedback from the teacher. They're supposed to work on it without help. And so I think a lot of what you do is those types of things I was just talking about leading up to the performance task. So it's our responsibility to make sure they have lots and lots of time to do writing, and that they're getting good feedback on their writing, that you've built up a collaborative culture in your classroom where they're used to working with a partner and how to hold each other accountable and work really well together. Those types of things, because once they go into the performance task, it really is, last iteration we saw, okay, so I'm looking, okay, I will try to hit mute and see if we can fix the feedback problem. But any case, so really it's all that scaffolding you do ahead of time before they get to the performance task to make sure that they're really well prepared for it. One other thing, this is something that's come up quite a lot with the piloters, is when you're looking at the performance task, you're not really supposed to provide feedback on it. That does not necessarily mean you can't grade it as a classroom assignment. I would just say, so for example, obviously we're not testing this year, but pretend like we had the AP exam at the end of the year. I personally don't like waiting till the end of the year to do both performance tasks, just because you run into all kinds of state testing, other AP tests. It's kind of, I did that one year and it was a mistake. It was too much at the end and the kids didn't do as well. So we're doing the Explore one right now. The school I'm in, their midterms are before winter break, so that's what they'll do leading up to winter break. So if this was a year where the AP exam was going to be collected, I would then collect those. If the website was open, I would go ahead and submit those, and then I could grade them for their midterm after they've been collected for College Board, if that makes sense. So I would not hand a grade back to them and have them have opportunities to continue to polish it. That's sort of, according to the rules, the way they were written when we saw them this last summer, that would not really be acceptable. So, all right, let me see if I can get the mute timed correctly.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So, so what other recommendations do you have for CSP teachers in respect to preparing students for the performance tasks?
I think, again, writing, if you can't tell. But I think, again, some of those other things is there's a lot of material you've got to cover in the course. As it sits, like we said, it's almost 400 LOs and EKs. One really, really fabulous resource, it's two of the pilot instructors down in Alabama have put together a website. And one of the things on their site, it's Abstracting CS. And one of the things that I think they've done a really fabulous job of is going through and pulling out the vocabulary for every single essential knowledge statement in the entire curriculum. We have a group of teachers that we're training here in Virginia, and we're actually working through the vocabulary together to try to make sure we've got sort of a construct for that. But it's an AP course, and there's going to need to be, I hate to say it, but some skill and drill in terms of vocab. And I think especially if you're dealing with, it's an elective course in a lot of places, so it's a fairly mixed bag of students that you're going to get. they're going to need help with that. And so making sure that they know the words, the terminology as they get to doing the performance task, they're going to go in with a little more confidence and do a better job of really answering what the questions are asking.
Fantastic. So then the next question that we had is, what are your favorite go-to resources right now for teachers who really want to dig in and learn how to teach the APCS Principles course at their school?
Right, I almost started without muting. I think there are some fabulous, fabulous resources. I think it's one of the really exciting things that we've seen is the CS community in general is really pulling together to try to pull a lot of stuff. You know, and if we look at the APCSA Java class, we have a very clear, there's sort of a canonical understanding of what a Java class is. If you go to any university that offers Java, they're going to be, you know, 90–95% the same for the most part. CS Principles, on the other hand, it's kind of a wild bag. This is the first time we've done some of the modeling and simulation and some of the data. One of my favorites, I've got it up right here. I don't know if I can manage a screen share. That might be a little too fancy for this. It's hosted on Duke. I can probably send you all links to put in like notes and stuff later. But it was originally created by Baker Frank, who is one of the original piloters. He now works for Code.org developing curriculum. But it's a keyword searchable version of the essential knowledge statements. And it's amazing. So I think one of the hardest things to get your head around is just the sheer volume of what's there. So for example, if I type in logic, which would help if I spelled it right. Oh, it only has, it's a G, not a J, oddly. So it pulls up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It pulls up the 7 times in the essential knowledge statements that pulls up. So I would definitely spend some time with that. Anytime you're about to cover a topic, going there and searching and see where else in the curriculum there are connections. Our pilot here in Virginia, we have a website, supercs.net, that we're sort of collaborating, and we share a lot of resources there. I think one of the absolute best resources is Jeff Gray's MOOC out of Alabama, and that really has just fabulous materials all the way through. Chris Mayfield here at James Madison University in Virginia has run his CS 101 as a CS Principles pilot for a couple years, and he's done a really nice job of putting together some videos. And I think one of the things I really appreciate about both Chris Mayfield's materials and Jeff Gray's materials is they're really thinking about the holes that a high school teacher might have in terms of their knowledge. You know, a lot of folks that are coming to this are business teachers who may have not, you know, they may have done a little bit of coding in some of their classes, but certainly not the deep dive that this course requires. And so they've really done a good job of creating some videos to really, I think, explain some of the topics that a lot of us were weaker on. I mean, this is my 20th year teaching high school computer science, and there are things in the curriculum I still don't feel 100% confident on, even though I've been doing this for a couple of years now. So those resources are particularly good. Code.org has put together a curriculum. Their tools that they have designed, they use JavaScript for that. And so I think some of their simulations and tools are very, very good. We've used some of those in what I'm doing with my students right now, and it really helps make things concrete. There's one other, oh gosh, oh, sorry. Almost forgot. Georgia Tech has also done an ebook that they have done in Python. I think Python, especially for folks who have not coded before, is a particularly good choice because it's a nice, easy language to start with. So I think there are lots and lots of good resources. I would also say the CS10K community is a really good place to start, and CSTA. You know, find out if you have a piloter nearby who might be willing to share resources. The CSTA community in general is fabulous about answering questions. You know, there's a question that went out the other day about someone who was just starting and trying to figure out what language to start in, and the amount of resources that community threw at them almost got to be overwhelming. So in any case, I think there are just lots and lots of different places, but anytime you can find a community of people who can answer your questions, I think you're in the best shape possible.
Thanks so much. That's a great list of resources. The option to teach APCS principles in any language has freed a lot of teachers up to do interesting, innovative things, but it can also be overwhelming in terms of choice and confusing in terms of how students will be kind of evaluated against each other in the performance tasks, you know, from one language to another. How can a teacher best prepare to deal with these concerns? And you know, what kind of advice would you give to teachers who are thinking about these things?
It would help if I unmuted. I think this is something that requires really a lot of thought at the onset. Usually when I do trainings, my first advice to people is pick a language that you are most comfortable in. If you have never coded before, this might not be the time to bite off C++. You know, and the thing is, the language you start in 3 years from now, it might be something different. So if you are completely brand new to computer science principles and computer science in general, you know, it's okay to start off in a language like Scratch that's drag and drop, or to use, you know, some other tool like that, especially while you're getting the other resources down. Your students, there's no better or worse in terms of how the performance task is graded by choosing a, I don't know, a fancier language, if that makes sense. So, you know, there's no snob appeal there. If you're comfortable in, you know, honestly, if you're comfortable in QBasic and that's all you know how to do, you know, I'm a QBasic fan. That's what I started my teaching career off in. But in all seriousness, whatever language works for you. And I think the other thing is look at the tools out there, look at which tools work best for you in your classroom. You know, and if you've got a lot of freedom and choice in terms of your school community, pick which works best for you, and it's going to create the least amount of friction. There are a lot of resources pretty much for any language you could look at out there. I think the thing to remember in terms of the performance task is the students are not being graded on how complicated their code is. I think there's a tendency to feel like this has to be a real, like, razzle-dazzle program, this amazing over the top, and it really doesn't. I think the first thing to do, actually we're doing this with our cohort, but I really suggest teachers sit down and do the performance tasks themselves. I think the best way to really understand them is to actually sit down and write it like you were being assessed on it. If you could find a buddy to do that with and swap papers and see what you think, you know, not to grade each other, but to really get that point of view. We're doing that with the cohort lately, and I think it's really helping. But the actual requirements are not that complicated. You don't have to get super in-depth in terms of what the students are actually producing. They're actually being graded on their writing, not their coding. And I think that's really important to remember. They will submit a video of their program. I think a lot of that is also to make sure that they actually wrote a program. You know, it's hard to do that if you're working in a bazillion different languages. I think one of the things too is if you're comfortable with a lot of differentiation, not all of your students have to write their create performance task in the same language. I had one year where I had, I think, 3 different languages because I had kids coming in from different places. I had a couple kids who'd actually finished AP-CSA, and we were treating CS principles as, if anybody remembers the old AB version of AP-CSA that got into data structures, you know, we covered all the regular material together, and then when we got to coding, my newbies, we did newbie stuff, and then my 4 or 5 kids who'd done the AP exam already went back and they did linked list and data structures. They kind of just sat in a corner and kept themselves busy. It was a little more self-directed then. But there are a lot of different ways you can construct this. So again, it's up to you, your classroom, how you feel comfortable. Again, in terms of the performance tasks, they're being graded on their ability to answer those questions. So it's actually conceivable that they could write a not great program or a not, I mean, hopefully a fully functioning program, but maybe it doesn't have all the features that they wanted it to. Maybe they're developing a mobile app and it doesn't, you know, it doesn't do everything they thought it was going to, or a game that doesn't quite get as far as they think it's going to. That's okay. It's about how they answer the questions and how they write about their collaboration. In terms of the multiple choice exam, at the end of the year, supposedly at the end of the school year, we will get the updated teaching guide, which will have some example multiple choice questions. We got a sneak peek of those this summer. It was sort of cloak of darkness. Everybody had to put their cell phone away kind of thing because they're still under revision. But I will say, having looked at them, I don't think the choice of language is going to make a difference in terms of how your students do on the multiple choice section of the exam. They were written in a very clear format. There's sort of a pseudocode that was being used that you know, eventually once we start seeing some example questions in, we'll all kind of have a better framework for what that looks like. But from what we saw this summer, I feel confident that students coming in from a wide variety of languages will be successful on those questions. You can tell they were putting a lot of effort and intention into not creating a gotcha situation where someone who'd coded in Python had an advantage over somebody with Scratch. It really was more centered, I think, on the algorithm and problem solving than sort of gotchas of coding, which is nice. I think that's been one of the problems with APCSA and why we haven't seen some of the diversity we'd like with that course, because it can be a little bit of a gotcha exam in terms of Java.
Great. Well, perfect transition. Just kind of referencing the AP Computer Science A. I know that you've actually taught that course for quite a while at your school. How do you see that connection of adding AP Computer Science principles to your overall program? It sounds like you've kind of fed one into the other, but as you kind of structure the pathway, what makes most sense at your school?
I think, again, this is one of those areas where you've got a lot of flexibility. I love APCSA. I've taught it since 1997 when we were in the dark ages of Pascal. I still kind of miss Pascal. But I think it's a class, I'm trying to think of how to put it. It's one of the few AP courses that's not really a 101 level class, if you think about it. If you walk into an AP psychology class, pretty much any college-bound student should be able to be successful in AP Psychology. And APCSA kind of is a step up from that. And so there's sort of a filtering that's happened through the years. So I think, now, just to back up, for most of my career, I was in a district where we had a full-time computer science teacher in every high school, and we had a middle school feeder program. I didn't realize it for the first decade how unusual we were. I kind of popped my head up when CSTA finally appeared. I was like, oh, this is not normal. I did not know that. But any case, so we actually had 5 levels of computer science at the high school level. When AB was an option, we included that. We also had International Baccalaureate, as I've mentioned. So one of the things, when I was first piloting, we had an intermediate programming class that was in C++. It was not my choice. C++ was just the language we had to use. A lot of our students filtered into engineering programs that use C++, so that's why that was there. And so I was very concerned when the first year of piloting, because we were not going to be able to do as much coding. It used to be 100% C++ coding class. And I was in a situation where I had some very strong students and some very less traditionally academically successful students in my program. My school itself was kind of a reverse bell curve. We had a lot of really strong and a lot of disparity at the other end, and not a huge amount of sort of your middle. And so I was really, really worried that my students at the bottom end academically were not going to be as well prepared for APCSA. And so that was sort of, kind of throw it in the wind, see what happened. I actually found my next couple of years of cycling through with those kids, they ended up doing much, much better in the Java class. And I was totally shocked my first year that happened. And like I said, my first year I had 16 kids in CS Principles. I then hopped to over 90. So it was a pretty big bubble I could kind of experiment on for the next year or two. And I think there were some things in CS Principles that allowed my students, and these are kids that probably didn't take any other advanced classes in high school but liked computers, so they stuck with that as an elective. And suddenly those kids that, for the last 15 years had been on that like DF line for a lot of their AP CSA class, all of a sudden were on kind of a BC line. It really was a huge hop. And I think we didn't, like my CS Principles pilot, I don't start coding at the very beginning of the year. My students actually, we've done a little HTML just for the abstraction, but we haven't actually started coding. We won't do that till after winter break, and that's very intentional. We focus a lot on problem solving. We do a lot of collaboration, and a lot of things to really build their confidence in terms of what computing is, what kinds of problems it solves. Obviously I've mentioned we're covering the internet right now, those types of things. Honestly, I moved coding until after students were allowed to drop, mostly because I didn't want to lose people because I'm sneaky. But I really saw a huge impact on my weaker students as they moved to APCSA, and I think they were a lot more confident in asking other students questions. And it was funny, it was silly things, like my very first year I had done a unit on Scratch, and then we transitioned into C++ because that's what I had to use. And that didn't work so well, but I had 1 or 2 students that on their own, anytime we had a tricky problem in C++, they would go back and solve it in Scratch and then use that as a prototype for how they would work in C++. And I'd never, I mean, I would love to claim that as an idea. It was not. It was one of my kids. But I've used Scratch that way ever since. Even though I personally don't do my pilot in Scratch, we use that as a prototyping language. And then I saw that start to happen in APCSA, where students that didn't quite have that abstract thinking yet and really struggled with, how do I go from this problem statement to coding in Java, it gave them that bridge in between. So I think we saw a huge increase in terms of their confidence, their willingness to ask questions, all of those kinds of just stick-to-itiveness that really make you successful in Java. And then, like I mentioned, I had a certain number of students who couldn't fit in the pilot and would get through APCSA and wanted to come back because they heard about what we were doing in the pilot. And so, I think it's an incredibly flexible course. The coding you have to cover is not as deep as I think a lot of us are used to thinking about at the high school level if you've run a CS program before, but you can go as deep as your students are willing and able to. And so, like, when I do the coding in CS Principles, we're never coding for an hour. I had an hour and a half block, so we were never coding for an hour and a half. We would code for 45 minutes, and then we would do other hands-on things. So we use squishy circuits a lot. If you've ever seen, though, Play-Doh conducts electricity, so you can make a simple logic gate out of Play-Doh and a battery pack and an LED. Battery packs are on sale on Amazon for like $2 for 5 right now if you're in the mood. But so early in the year when we talk about binary, we would pull those out and just say, okay, this is actually how your computer works. It's on-off switches. And then when we get to the internet, if you stretch the Play-Doh out, you get a lot of resistance. And so, well, that's why you need repeaters in the internet when you talk about the physical structure. Then when we get to if statements and booleans, we come back to it, and I divide half the class up, and one half does the OR gate, and one half does the AND gate. And just, we've done booleans, we've explained what an AND and an OR gate is, and I just throw the materials out there. It's like, okay, guys, 45 minutes, just play. And it's okay if not everybody gets it. Honestly, I forget the answer every year, and I have a cheat sheet of pictures that I look it up on because I can never remember how it works. And then we just kind of do a gallery walk and look and have them talk about, like, well, this is how, and you'll have 3 or 4 different solutions to each one of them. But one of the things that really, really did, and I saw a huge leap with APCSA from this, my students started to understand, I think for the first time, coding is not hard to keep you out. Coding can be hard because it's physically how the computer's structured. And it took going through the pilot 1 or 2 times for me to really understand. And I mean, I'd been teaching CS for 50 years. It's the kind of obvious stuff that bangs you upside the head. But I think a lot of my students that struggled really felt like they just make I think we feel that way about math sometimes too. They just make this hard, to make it hard. And, well, no, Booleans work the way they do. And yeah, they're wacky and they're strange and they're really tricky the first time you get them to work. But it's because that's how the computer itself is hardwired. And having them actually see and play and do things, if you can't tell by the background in my office, I make things a lot. It's my loom in the background. And so anytime I think you can bring hands-on stuff in, it really helps. But I really saw a leap in my students' confidence when they got to APCSA from a lot of those experiences.
Yeah, what a neat idea. I cannot wait to try those ideas in my classroom. So just in terms of thinking differently about the CS AP courses, how do you recruit for the AP CS Principles course? You made this great jump from 15 to 90, which is amazing, but how did you kind of market it to your school, and how do you market it differently than your Java AP course?
I got very, very lucky. I happened to be an hour from UVA, where the fabulous Joanne Cahoon started doing her Tapestry Workshops. Actually, that's another resource for folks. Joanne has all of her PowerPoints and information. If you've never gotten a chance to go to one of those and one comes near you, please go. You need to do that. And so her research and work, she works a lot with NCWIT and really focuses on how do we invite females into computing and what are some of the barriers that we're unintentionally creating. And I think one of the things that was sort of an aha moment for me was I had been told, like literally my first year of teaching, I taught math, and then Mr. O'Brien got promoted to the school board office, and I used to go in and print things out in Mr. O'Brien's computer lab, so therefore I got to be the next computer science teacher. It was totally logical. You know, that's probably how most of us land in these jobs. But I was told when he sat down and explained to me what to do, oh, you go to math classes because kids that are good at math are good at computer science, so that's where you go to recruit. So for years, that's what I did because that's what I was told to do. And really going through the Tapestry workshops made me question that. And even the fact that even if, yes, we know that students who have strengths in math are frequently talented in computer science, the problem is students in high school have a really bad meter for deciding if they're good at math or not. A lot of boys will sort of identify as being good at math, even though that's not necessarily true. And on the other hand, a lot of girls will not identify as being good as math. And, you know, I think back, I was one of those girls. I learned QBasic when I was in the 7th grade. We got an Apple IIe. It was fabulous because it checked my spelling, and I got to kind of bunk around and figure out some coding, which I loved. And so I had this weird little hobby. And I remember the day that the AP computer science teacher at my high school came to my pre-cal class, and I had a 99 in pre-cal. Like, I was, in hindsight, I was actually a good math student. I didn't know it at the time. And he said, you know, like, he's going on about coding, and I was like, I had no idea this was a thing. This sounds fabulous. And I remember the moment he said, and if you're good at math, you'll be really good at computer science. And that was the moment I was like, oh, yeah, well, then I'm not doing that. You know, I had a 99 in the class, and I'd been coding since I was 12, and yet at 17, I didn't identify as being, quote, good at math. And I think, you know, again, if you ever get a chance to go to one of the Tapestry workshops or use her materials, she does a really good job of articulating that. So one of the things I did is I stopped going to math classes because there's an automatic filter if you're standing there, even if you don't say, and if you're good at math, just standing there, you associate with it. So I started going to advanced English classes. I basically went to anywhere that didn't have a filter on it, where like every 9th grader is locked in the same class, where kids that self-identify as being college-bound collected. One of the other things I think long-term that's going to be very, very interesting is if you're in a school right now that does AP and the students take the PSATs, you can run the AP potential reports. It can sometimes take a little bit of nagging to figure out who in your school does it. If your school is not always already routinely running them, it can take a little bit of troubleshooting to figure it out. But usually it's somebody in guidance or whoever administers your AP exams can go. It's a very simple report for them to run. You're not, you know, it doesn't require cookie baking to talk them into it. But with APCSA, we know, like, there's been enough years of APCSA, we have a correlation with which PSAT scores or indicate that a student has potential in APCSA. So one of the things I also did was go through that and mail out letters to students who had high potential. We don't know that data for CS principals yet because we don't have any exams. So I went through and just picked anybody that was sort of advanced looking on the math section. Now when I mailed out the letter, I did not tell them or their parents that's why they were picked. I just said, your PSAT score shows that you have a high potential to do well in APCS principles. And what the cut score was, it was whatever I was highlighting when I was going through the list. Honestly, there's no science behind that. But there's a real power to being invited to something. And I kind of tweaked the language. I sent different letters to boys than girls. Both of them emphasized the number of jobs and income. But with the letter that went out to parents of girls, I also really emphasized how many different industries use computer science, how it was a helping industry, especially in medicine and places like that, and emphasized a lot about, you know, these are very flexible jobs. You're not, you know, trying to kind of break down that stereotype that you're locked in the basement with some weird guy in the next cube while you're just coding by yourself all day. That it's social, you work in a team, and that they're jobs that are really of service to people. Yeah.
Wonderful. Many schools have a difficult time filling one AP computer science course. Do you find the two courses as potentially competing with each other? And how would you suggest if a school was, you know, only had 30 or 40 potential students, which computer science course would you, or which AP computer science course would you start with first?
You know, it's a tricky question, and we're currently working with some schools that are actually grappling with this a little bit. A lot of our work here in Virginia is training teachers from very rural school districts, so a district that might have one high school, one middle school, and one elementary school. Those types of situations, and resources do get to be an issue. I know we've had some schools talk about alternating, where maybe one year they do CS principles and then the following year they do AP CSA. It kind of breaks my heart to say this, but if I absolutely had to choose, I think I probably would pick the APCS principles. And I say that with all the love in my heart for APCSA. I love that class. But I do think this is important enough that every child going through high school needs to have access to this information. And the fact is, APCSA, there is a bit of a hurdle to get to that class. That's not to say we can't do a better job of inviting students in. But honestly, even if students leave these classes and they're like, you know, that was fun, but I'm not ever going to code again, that's fine. There's a lot of information that we really need students thinking about in the APCS principles course that they're not engaging with in the same way with APCSA. You know, we really need them thinking about, you know, modeling and simulation. How does that impact my world? Privacy, big data. What does that actually mean? What data is being collected about me? You know, how do I make decisions and how I represent myself in a public sphere, online, those types of things. Our students are graduating into a world that is drastically different than we came out of college into, or even high school into. And I think the CS Principles course has a really, really rich curriculum around that. Obviously, I want as many kids coding as possible, and I think the fact that this class is so accessible to many, many students, I think there's a huge potential to really have this class broaden the number of kids. And honestly, I saw, for me, I mean, I'd had a very consistent enrollment in APCSA. You know, we had 1,400 to 1,600 students in my school, the school that I was in for 17 years. You know, some years it was a struggle to get 15 kids. I very rarely had more than 20 or 21 kids in APCSA, and like I said, CS Principles the second year really took off, and we were up at 90. So I think it really touched a nerve, and you know, my students were dragging their friends in to show off what we're doing and working on. It kind of sold itself after a while, which was fabulous. Cut down on my work, but I think that says a lot. You know, like I said, I love APCSA. I think if a school has the opportunity to offer it, I think it's great for students who really want that deep dive. But I think, you know, if you can have both, I think that's a richer opportunity for students in terms of just being citizens in a modern world.
Fantastic. Well, Maureen, did you have any other questions or any questions from our feed? Okay, great. Well, thank you, Rebecca Dovi, for sharing your time and expertise with us. This has been some great insight into your experience piloting the AP CS Principles course, and we look forward to tracking more of the great work that you do. And thank you all for watching our Hangout on Air. Please keep your eye out for more great Q&A sessions, and we look forward to seeing you there. Thank you.
Thank you.